So today we're going to do one of my favorite things. We're going to talk about texture in art. I love this because I like getting up close. I like being able to touch things. And that's really what texture is all about today. All right, so what is texture? Texture appeals to your sense of touch. It can make you feel different things. Everything has some kind of texture. We can touch the table in front of us. It may be smooth. We could probably reach out and touch that silk. It would just be really soft. Maybe sandpaper, which would be gritty. We use words to help us describe that texture. So fluffy, gritty, scratchy. And when we think of these things, you know, sometimes they make us feel things. Yeah. So let's play a game and see what we're talking about. How can texture make us feel things? Okay. So here we have fluffy. And what else do we think of? Maybe soft. Now maybe if like some of those hairs get in our nose, it may even be a little bit itchy. But it also makes us feel things, usually happy. Unless it's in our nose, that may make us not like it. And here we have something that looks like a close-up of sandpaper. Now, looking at this, I don't think I'd want to run this across my arm or my leg. It looks kind of ouchy. So that makes me feel something. Here we have tires. Who would think of tire? But tires have really neat texture. This is almost something like I would just like have fun running my hands over something. I would just like touching this. And here we have a frog. Now, frog, we think slimy. For some people that might be icky, and for other people that may be really cool. They may like that texture. So different textures can actually mean different things to different people. We do have types of texture. So we have something here called real or actual texture. Now we can't show you real or actual texture through a computer screen because that screen is flat and it's smooth, but we're going to try to show you what real texture is. So if we look at rocks, you think these rocks here are probably smooth and they would be kind of nice to touch. And we see something like the wood. This may even be a little bit ouchy. You may get some splinters from it. Definitely rough. If you try to do a rubbing on it, it's going to give you that rough texture. We have something else here that's called visual or implied texture. This is what we normally see when we look at a picture or at our computer screens. It's something that someone drew or made to imply that texture. So when we see this, we think of rippling water, even though it's not. Or we see this pattern and it may look bumpy, even though it's not. It's meant to fool the eye into thinking there's a texture, even though it may be flat and smooth. There's something else in texture called variation and relief. And really, these are ways that you can enhance or make that texture even more noticeable. So you can have more impact by contrasting, by putting rough areas against smooth areas. So if you have maybe a piece of silk next to a piece of sandpaper, you would really notice that even more. These, there's some techniques that are really neat and ways to use texture. Now we have over here, we're going to look first at the trompe l'oeil. This is painting, so this is on a smooth wall, but they're doing this rough texture here around to make it look like pillars, maybe like an older building, and it's looking out a scene. It's really just a smooth flat wall, and they painted this on it to look fake. Here again, we have another trompe l'oeil. We have these awesome flower pots, but then down below, in order to make it look, you know, neat and kind of give it a lot more depth, they painted these columns. They're not real columns, they're fake columns, but it gives you that depth. It gives you, you know, that feeling of oldness to it. Now here we have some things that are called collage. This is when you put all kinds of different things together, usually on a flat surface. Sometimes it can be three-dimensional like this, to create something new. This is going to be more like something we're going to make a little bit later through all of our experiments today. This is just a bunch of different kinds of paper and paint, and they put together to make something that's visually appealing. Now, it looks rough, but when you touch it, maybe the only kind of rough you'll feel is where the different papers are glued on. Texture in abstract art. Abstract art uses a lot of texture. Makes you want to reach out and kind of touch something. Some paintings we don't think of as abstract, and we don't really think of as really when we think of texture, but they do have a lot of texture, would be Van Gogh. He uses a technique called impasto, and this is when you apply the paint really thickly to show different kinds of shadows and lights, and maybe down here some movement. He uses it to show that. We also have this beautiful picture of the sun. The texture almost makes it feel hotter, like there's heat waves coming off. Then we have the opposite of impasto, which is flatness. Now flatness is actually when they pour the paint on so thin to an unprimed canvas that in this case it actually cracked when it dried. So at first it was very glossy, very flat, very smooth, but when it dried it did create this other technique. And then here we think of, this is more of what we think of with flatness. When you're going to touch it, it's just completely flat. There's no contrast, there's no darkness or lightness, it's just flat. Alright, so our first experiment, let's get down to it. We're going to need a bunch of paper today. You're going to need some different things. You're going to go on some scavenger hunts today. So let's start together. We're going to work our way through these experiments, and then at the end we're going to take our experiments and make a really cool collage.
Alright, so we are ready for experiment 1. These are just things that I found around my house to use for some rubbings. If you've never done a rubbing before, you're just going to use some crayons, and you're going to want to use kind of the side of the crayon. You can unwrap it if that's easier for you. This is just a piece of cardboard box, and I started with this one just by rubbing it to get that really awesome texture. I have some sandpaper here, so let me try and see what kind of texture I get here. Okay, so on this one, not a great texture. Still okay. It's a little bit pretty. And we're just going to do a whole bunch of these, maybe like about 6 to 8 of them. Different kinds of textures that we found sitting around our house. Alright, so we have a bunch of those. We are done with our experiment 1. I gotta tell you, that one is probably my favorite. That turned out really neat. So I'm super excited about that one. That is probably my least favorite. I thought it was going to turn out really cool like this one did, but it didn't. But that's why these are experiments, because different colors with, you know, even though it's the same item, came out completely different. Alright guys, let's jump back and see what's next.
Alright. So now that you've got your first one done with rubbings, we're going to move on to experiment number 2. You can use the same items you used in 1 as long as you could paint on them. So you may or may not want to.
Okay, so we are ready for experiment number 2. Now remember on this, just play, have fun. We're going to try painting with some different textures. I've already been trying a few of these. Some of them work, some of them don't. So the first thing I am going to try, because I tried this a few minutes ago and it was a fail, but I'm going to try it a different way, and let's see if it works this way. I'm going to try on blue. Alright, I don't know how well you can see that texture. Really neat little texture there. Oh, let me lift this off again. Okay, put this down here to dry. And I think that's all the textures we have. Alright, let's go on to our next experiment.
Alright. So we're getting a little bit closer again, further down in these experiments. We're going to talk for just a second about what collages are. Now, collages are really just French for glue. It's when you take different kinds of paper or different things and you glue it together to make something new. I can think of one of my favorite children's authors and illustrators. He is a wonderful collage artist, Eric Carle. So let's look right here. We've got a picture of him making some of his famous papers that he uses. And here he's just actually using a roller, making some neat things. He uses some scrapers to provide more texture and patterns. And he's created all of these. These all come from the Eric Carle Museum. Fabulous collages out of them. So we're going to do something a little bit Eric Carle-y in this experiment. All right, so we're going to use our paints again. We're going to use a little bit more paper, and let's make our Eric Carle things together.
Okay, so we are back. Now with this one, we're going to use that kind of impasto technique. We're going to try to make those, recreate something there, and we're going to use, I'm using the little divots on this fork. So hopefully we can create some cool textures. And I'm going to be working in yellow. So I'm going to put the paint right onto it. And then I'm going to be kind of very cool. And this one, oh, I like that a lot. That makes it really, really, really neat. Okay, so if the paint gets too thin, that one. Alright guys, so you can do this one a bunch more if you want. I have so many, I think I've got enough. So we're going to move on to our next experiment. Let's find out what it is.
We are to our last experiment before we have all our kinds of textured paper to put together our collage. So this last one is not something that you would usually think of when you think of textures, but it makes some great things to use in with a collage. This is when you use wavy lines, maybe those doodles that you drew in class, maybe, you know, you did like a Zentangle kind of thing. We're going to do that, and then we're going to cut them up and put them in our collage. So here's some examples. And these are just fun little things to doodle with. And we're going to cut those up and put those in our collage. So let's make a few together now.
All right, so we are going to work on our last experiment. And we're going to draw some really cool textures using just a black pen and a white piece of paper. I don't like that piece of paper. And it can be anything you want. It can be circles, it can be whatever you want.
Alright, we are finally ready to make our collage. So gather up all of your textured things, experiments that we did together, and let's put them together to make a really cool collage on texture.
Alright, so we are ready. I separated all of my things into different color piles or different textures, and I am going to make a collage out of them. So whatever you use, don't throw away. You can always save it and make another collage. So let's see what you come up with. I would love to see it. Put it down in the comments below, and here we go. Alright, so I have my very own Eric Carle inspired piece of artwork as my collage, and I look forward to seeing what you guys put in the comments down below.